If money is trust made visible, then central banks are the institutions built to defend that trust when it is most fragile. They did not emerge from theory, nor were they designed by economists drawing elegant diagrams. Central banks were born in moments of fear after wars, panics, defaults, and collapses, when societies realized that leaving money entirely to kings, merchants, or markets invited chaos. The birth of central banking was not an act of ambition, it was an act of survival. In the early modern world, there were no guardians of the economy. States borrowed when they could, defaulted when they must, and debased when desperation outweighed shame. Banking existed, but it was private, fragmented, and perilous. Credit flowed through merchant houses, goldsmiths, and city banks, each exposed to rumor and run. When confidence broke, there was no backstop. Panic meant collapse, and collapse often meant war, revolution, or famine. The first central banks emerged as solutions to a specific problem. How could governments borrow large sums at reasonable cost without destroying confidence? The answer required something radical, an institution that stood between state and market credible enough to reassure lenders, powerful enough to enforce discipline, and flexible enough to respond to crisis. This balancing act would define central banking forever. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, is often remembered as the prototype. England was at war with France and desperately needed funds. The government struck a bargain with financiers. In exchange for lending money to the crown, they would receive a chartered bank with privileges, including note issuance and a close relationship with the state. This was not a neutral institution. It was a political compromise. Yet it changed history. For the first time, a state bound itself institutionally to honor its debts. Credibility became systemic, not personal. Interest rates fell. Britain's capacity to wage war and build empire expanded dramatically, but the Bank of England did not begin as a guardian of stability. It evolved into one. Early central banks learned their role through failure. Banking panics swept through Europe repeatedly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Credit expanded during booms, then vanished during busts. Each crisis raised the same question: who would provide liquidity when everyone demanded cash at once? The answer slowly emerged through practice rather than design the central bank as lender of last resort. Walter Bagehot would later codify the rule: lend freely at a penalty rate against good collateral, but long before theory caught up, central banks were already improvising. When panic struck, inaction proved fatal. Intervention, however controversial, proved stabilizing. Central banks learned that hesitation destroyed trust faster than risk-taking ever could. France followed a different path. The Banque de France, established under Napoleon in 1800, reflected a more centralized vision. It was closely aligned with state power, designed to stabilize currency and finance government needs. Its authority was less subtle, more explicit. Yet the goal was the same: monetary order. Across Europe, central banks emerged, not as champions of markets, but as arbiters restraining excess. In good times, containing collapse in bad. The 19th century gold standard imposed discipline on central banks, but also constrained them. Gold anchored money, limited issuance, and reassured markets. But it also forced painful adjustments. When gold flowed out, interest rates rose, recessions followed, and unemployment climbed. Central banks became enforcers of discipline rather than managers of prosperity. Stability came at the cost of flexibility. This trade-off would haunt monetary history. The 20th century shattered the old order. World War I forced governments to abandon gold to survive. Inflation surged, currencies fractured. When the war ended, societies faced a dilemma: return to discipline or adapt to reality. Some tried to restore gold at pre-war parities. The result was deflation, unemployment, and social unrest. Central banks bound by old rules deepened collapse rather than prevented it. The Great Depression was the central banking system's darkest hour. Banks failed by the thousands. Money supply contracted. Credit evaporated. Central banks either could not or would not act decisively. In the United States, the Federal Reserve, young, decentralized, uncertain, watched passively as the economy imploded. This failure permanently altered the mandate of central banking. Never again, policymakers vowed, would guardians of money allow the system to collapse from inaction. Out of depression and war emerged a new conception of the central bank. No longer merely a defender of gold or a financier of the state, it became a manager of the macroeconomy. Bretton Woods institutionalized this vision. Central banks were tasked with supporting growth, maintaining stability, and coordinating globally. Monetary policy became an instrument of governance, not just a technical function. Yet with expanded power came expanded risk. Managing money meant managing expectations. Too much restraint risked unemployment. Too much accommodation risked inflation. Central banks walked a narrow path between credibility and compassion. The post-war decades suggested success growth was strong, crises rare. But beneath the surface, imbalances accumulated. When inflation surged in the 1970s, central banks faced a reckoning. They could no longer promise prosperity without consequence. The Volcker shock of the early 1980s redefined central banking again. By raising interest rates dramatically to crush inflation, the Federal Reserve asserted a new priority price: stability above all. Central banks gained independence from political pressure, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity. Trust in money required distance from electoral cycles. Independence became the cornerstone of modern central banking. For decades, this model appeared triumphant. Inflation fell. Markets stabilized. Central bankers became quiet technocrats, speaking in careful language, guiding expectations rather than commanding outcomes. But the calm concealed fragility. Financial innovation expanded leverage beyond regulation. Shadow banking grew outside traditional oversight. Central banks guarded prices, but not balance sheets. When crisis returned in 2008, it returned with unprecedented force. The response transformed central banks once more. Interest rates fell to zero. Balance sheets exploded. Central banks became buyers of last resort market makers and crisis managers. They saved the system, but at the cost of blurring boundaries between monetary policy and fiscal support. Guardianship expanded into dominance, and with dominance came scrutiny. Today, central banks stand at a crossroads. They are expected to stabilize economies, contain inflation, prevent crises, support growth, and preserve financial stability, often simultaneously. They are criticized when they act, blamed when they do not. They wield immense power, yet rely entirely on trust. Their credibility is their currency. Looking back across centuries, one truth emerges clearly. Central banks are not masters of the economy. They are custodians of confidence. They exist because societies learned repeatedly and painfully that money left unguarded invites disaster. But guardianship is never permanent. It must be earned continuously through restraint, clarity, and courage, especially when the easiest path is to promise more than money can deliver. And as modern economies strain under debt, demographic pressure, and political polarization, the role of central banks grows heavier. They are asked to do what institutions have always been asked to do in times of stress: hold the line between stability and collapse. Whether they can continue to do so without eroding the trust that sustains them is the defining question of our era. A question whose answer will shape not only markets and inflation, but the legitimacy of economic governance itself, a legitimacy that history suggests is never lost. Suddenly but slowly, as expectations drift, promises multiply, and guardians find themselves pulled from all sides toward decisions that cannot satisfy everyone. Decisions that will ultimately reveal whether central banks remain the quiet anchors of the system or become the focal point of the next great reckoning. A reckoning that will arrive not as a single policy error, but as a test of legitimacy, of whether institutions built to guard money can still command belief in an age of permanent crisis. For central banks today operate in a world profoundly different from the one that gave them birth, yet they carry expectations forged by centuries of hard lessons. The modern central bank is no longer a distant referee. It is embedded in markets, politics, and daily life. When rates rise, mortgages reset. When rates fall, asset prices surge. When balance sheets expand, inequality debates ignite. Every decision redistributes wealth across time and society, even when framed as technical necessity. This is the paradox of central banking power. It must act decisively to preserve stability, yet doing so exposes it to scrutiny that can erode the very trust it depends on. History shows that guardianship becomes most controversial when it is most effective. The interventions of 2008 and the years that followed prevented a second Great Depression. Yet, by stabilizing markets, central banks also reshaped incentives. Risk-taking returned faster than wages. Asset owners recovered sooner than workers. The perception took hold that central banks served markets more than societies. Whether fair or not, this belief matters, because credibility is not measured by outcomes alone, but by legitimacy in the public mind. Then came a new shock. Pandemic supply chains, fiscal expansion on a scale unseen outside war. Central banks once again acted as shock absorbers, flooding systems with liquidity to prevent collapse. Inflation followed, and with it, the hardest test. Central banks face withdrawing support without breaking trust. Tighten too slowly, and prices run ahead of credibility. Tighten too fast, and financial stress fractures stability. The narrow path reappears as it always does. This tension is not a flaw of central banking, it is its essence. From the Bank of England's wartime bargains to Volcker's brutal resolve, central banks have always balanced competing truths. Money must be stable, but economies are not. Trust must be preserved, but promises are tempting. Independence must be defended, but accountability cannot be ignored. Each era resolves these tensions differently, but none escapes them. What history makes clear is that central banks endure only when their mandate remains narrow enough to be credible and broad enough to be useful. When asked to solve structural problems, inequality, productivity politics, they inevitably disappoint. When focused on guarding the value of money and the functioning of the system, they earn trust over time. The danger of the modern age is not that central banks lack tools. It is that they are asked to substitute tools for decisions societies must make themselves. And so the story of central banks is not a story of omnipotence, but of constraint. They were invented because unguarded money destroys societies. They survive because societies accept limits on discretion in exchange for stability. When that acceptance phrase central banking becomes fragile, not because rates are wrong, but because belief is, looking forward, the guardians face a transformed landscape. Digital currencies challenge their monopoly. Fragmented geopolitics weaken coordination. Heavy debt narrows policy space. Expectations, hardened by decades of stability, are slow to adjust. In such a world, the greatest asset a central bank can possess is not its balance sheet, but its credibility. And credibility is built not in crises, but in what institutions choose to protect when trade-offs are unavoidable. The final lesson of central banking's birth and evolution is therefore sobering and simple. Money needs guardians, But guardians cannot replace judgment. They can buy time. They cannot buy trust indefinitely. Every generation must decide what it asks its central banks to do and what it asks of itself. If this journey through the rise of central banks changed how you see interest rates, inflation, or monetary power, share what resonated most. And if you want to continue exploring how invisible institutions shape visible history, follow the channel and stay with this story, because the guardians of the economy are only as strong as the trust that stands behind them. And history shows that trust once tested always demands an answer.